Moving on to our speakers this afternoon, Steve Shapiro is currently with the law firm Pircher, Nichols Meeks and also has extensive in-house experience as general counsel and corporate secretary. Steve is a recognized member of the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals and is regularly an expert panelist at society events. Steve is often consulted on board-related matters, and I want to thank you, Steve, for joining us here today. Then moving on, Tom Racicot is currently the Global Head of Sales for Computershare Governance Services with over 15 years of experience with global leading entity management and board portal solutions. Tom's expertise with corporate governance solutions is very extensive, and he's managed and overseen the deployment of board portal solutions across the globe. With that, I will now turn over the presentation to Tom and Steve. Thanks, Tom and Steve.
Thank you, Brian.
Thanks again, Brian. I guess if everybody's looking at the slide, I'll start off, Tom, if that's okay, on traditional board delivery. Before Tom tells us about the board portal technology and discusses the advantages of it, I think we all need to take a step back and look at what is usually done, or the old way. And many of this, if you were in charge of or worked with various board reporters to prepare board books, this will look very familiar. And even though I am in private practice now, I was in-house, as Brian said, and I have a lot of experience, way too much experience in preparing board books. So if you look at this slide, you know that the process of preparing board books sometimes as infrequently as 4 times a year for quarterly board meetings, but frequently much more common than that, or much more frequently than that when there are special meetings. The first slide talks about manual indexing, and of course what we know is what's involved in that is a lot of copying, and then some more copying. You have to make sure you know where your directors are, and of course if you're late one day with where the board books are going to be delivered, then you have to make sure that that board member who might be traveling is going to be at the location you thought, or if not, find out where he or she is going to be. There's courier delivery, and of course we've all had the experience, I think, where we have to make sure that the package is delivered and not picked up by somebody who shouldn't get it, whether it's their front porch or at a hotel room. And ultimately the risk is that there could be unsecured delivery either by email or otherwise of sensitive materials. Of course, the other problem with email is that email can be forwarded, and frankly, I think there's very few people, I am not one of them, who has not sent an email to a wrong place. Fortunately, nothing serious, but it's just as easy when you type in 3 letters to somebody and push send that it goes to somebody, not the person you intended to. When you're talking about very highly sensitive materials of public companies, it can be very serious. Sometimes these items are stored on non-secured PCs if they're emailed, and you have no way of getting about it or even finding out about it if you are a corporate secretary or general counsel. And the copying also includes potentially extra copies in the boardroom. And of course, everybody knows, going back to the copying issue, that if one page is out of order, then maybe you have to redo the entire book. And so that probably sounds familiar, as I said, and is the world that existed before board portals. Tom, you want to take us on the wonderful technology we now have available?
Certainly. And so the board portal is really the new here and now way of doing board meetings. In a simple statement, I think it's a centralized, secure, single location to assemble, collate, distribute, and ultimately destroy your board materials. So it's one central place where all your communication. So sort of all of the things that Steve just sort of outlined in sort of the traditional methodology that pose challenges, the board portal essentially eliminates all of those challenges, right? So it's a secure website. Only those that have the correct privileges and access are going to be able to get in and access the information. It's a green solution, so eliminating printing, or at least eliminating the majority of printing. It's a centralized location, so you don't have multiple copies of your board materials floating out in and around the company or external once you've curried them out to all of your individual people. It's like I said, secure location. We'll talk more about security. I think the security of a portal is paramount. I mean, that's really what the security and compliance is really what the portal is all about. There's a convenience factor to it as well, but from a company's perspective, it really is the security and the ability to know where your materials are at any point in time is one of the real kind of key components there. So we'll talk more about sort of the security, and I think Steve and I both have a couple of different examples as we kind of go through this that can shed light on that. So Brian, why don't you go ahead to moving on here. As we're talking about technology, it really, there's one primary technology that has changed the whole face of the board portals, and it is the iPad. The portal solutions have been around for a while. They've been around really as long as the internet has been, and companies have been creating different sites, and directors can go in and get their information. And you can do that securely, but it's that accessibility, it's that portability that was never really available until the iPad came along. And the iPad has revolutionized how board members or how companies are distributing this information. So couple quick statistics that I thought were interesting. So everybody can use the iPad. I mean, I have a 2-year-old, and she's more active with an iPad than I am. But 22% of Americans over the age of 50 and 36% of Americans with household income over $75,000 a year have iPads today. That's research as of January 2012 from the Pew Research Group. And the numbers that they're reporting from the holiday season this year with the iPad and the iPad mini, those numbers are going to significantly increase in January 2013's numbers. So the iPad is here to stay. That's our demographic of the board that's using these. Over a third of the board members already have iPads. So this piece of technology really has changed how people are getting their information and how they're bringing it into meetings. Brian? So as the board portal really allows for all levels of security factors, right? So it's far beyond the traditional methods that Steve was talking about. You really can go in and create access levels into individual meetings, into things that you can't easily do with paper, like identify who within the meeting has access to certain chapters of the book, who has the ability to see certain things in the meeting. You can bring guests into the meeting without giving them the entire book very, very simply. It does things. We go into a lot of board meetings and help companies roll out these systems and things like that. I was in one recently when we were talking about security, and one of the directors stood up or put his hand up and said, "You mean we're supposed to shred these books after the board meeting?" And I think after the corporate secretary picked herself off the floor and said, "Well, yeah." He said, "Well, I have a library of these books at home. I keep all my notes. I keep everything." And there's a whole discoverability concept around that most companies now have record retention policies to destroy those books, to shred those books. And a lot of people do the art of pushing the books to the middle of the room and shred them at the end of the meeting. But sometimes they end up going home with companies. The portal eliminates that process. The portal automatically gives you the ability to either on a timed basis, so 24 hours after the meeting, destroy it, or on a manual basis, go in and wipe the board book clean after the process. We have the high level sort of aspects of it. Again, a lot of the things that Steve talked about, but the time saving around collecting all the information, collating all that information, changing it when the board material changes 10 minutes before the book needs to be printed, printing them, shipping them, finding where you got to ship it to find the director, whether they're on the airplane, they're at a hotel, they're in their office, they're at home, doing all that, then putting in those last minute supplements. The day of the board meeting, making your last minute changes and modifications, and you can do all of that in a board portal with just a couple clicks, and you can easily kind of boil it all down into one easy book versus pulling papers out, unbinding things, and moving them around. So that those that Steve had sort of had mentioned. All right, well, Brian. So we've covered off a lot of these, and we don't need to necessarily go into all the details. And between Steve and myself, we'll highlight a bunch of these as we kind of go through. But I thought this was a good slide to put in here to really kind of articulate, the security and efficiencies that are created both for the directors as well as the administrators. And there's really two sides of it when you really break down who's using it. And if you start on the right side there with the administrators, it really is a very cumbersome process to gather all that information, to collate that information and print it and go through that whole process. The portal centralizes it and creates areas so that you don't have to email. You don't have to share files. You can easily individually post the information up into the portal. So when the CFO has the materials ready, they can put it up, or their admin can put them up. The CEO, when they have their statements, they can put them in. And everybody can kind of build their own pieces directly into the book without have to, sending and emailing and dropping zip drives and all those kinds over to a secretary and building them that way. You can do it more efficiently. And on the director receiving it, they're getting it all on an iPad. They're getting it all on a laptop. They don't have to be carrying around, a book that has 500 pages or 600 pages, or if they're sitting on 2 or 3 boards, now you got 1,500 pages of materials that you're carrying around in a bag. You have all that information easily on your iPad, and that's obviously one of the real big selling features of the iPad, with being able to put multiple books and materials and everything on one, pound-and-a-half piece of technology. So, Steve, did you want to add anything on the efficiency side of it?
No, I mean, I think you laid it out well. I think it goes to one of the most important aspects of the board portals.
I just had one more. I know we're hitting home on security here, but I think when you look at the board portal, it really is, from my perspective, one of the number one advantages or reasons to go to a portal. And if we look at a couple of these email, as convenient as it can be, Steve's example of setting it to the wrong person, but even beyond that is the discoverability. E-discovery is one of the hottest topics in the legal world these days. And your directors, especially your non-executive directors, work for other companies. So when you email it out, when Steve and I share emails, he sends me an email. That email is now property of ComputerShare, and vice versa. And so your directors, it's the same thing. So if you're sending board materials out via email, now you got to go through and you get that whole big e-discovery process that can be quite challenging, and nobody wants to go through it. The portal allows you to contain it within one place and destroy it at the end of the meeting. Encryption, it's always there's a mystery to people around sort of data encryption and those kinds of things. But data encryption and the ability to lock down files, add passwords to files, do all of that work to files is so far beyond what you can do with paper. I've heard the examples of a courier. What's to stop a courier from it's going to a big name director, ripping that piece of that little piece of paper off the top of the envelope and looking what's inside. It's that simple, right? And I hear all the time people they'll leave the books behind after the meeting, or they'll accidentally leave it in the hotel room, or they'll leave it on the at the table at the restaurant after they left. And the materials are everywhere. If it's paper, it's there for anybody to pick up and read. What happens if your device is compromised? Again, if somebody has the paper book and they lose their laptop bag, or somebody steals the paper away from them, they have that paper. If you lose your iPad, there's easy ways through the portals, through our system, through other systems, where you can easily just purge whatever's on that iPad. So if I have important materials on my device, I leave it on the airplane, the administrator can go in and just wipe that clean instantly. And it really does, add a whole other level of security that you would not have in the paper world. We talked about a bunch of these already: saving time, deletion of books. Again, security is the underpinning of the whole process. There's a whole convenience factor. I think we'll kind of talk a little bit about that in some of the delivery and some of the other examples that we have, but at least wanted to start out kind of setting the mindset of security and the purposes of having the board portal around controlling your documents, knowing where your documents are, and being able to bring your documents back or destroy your documents at really a click of a button. And that's really, to me, what a lot of the board portal is all about.
And so, although this board technology, as Tom laid out and I've experienced and seen in action, is truly wonderful technology with a lot of advantages, there are still cautionary items that we need to discuss because with all technology, it is not an end in itself. And in the first half or first top of this slide, I wasn't around when word processing was created, but pretty much I've been practicing law while the last three items, overnight delivery and faxes and email, were integrated into the practice of law. And again, all advance the practice of law and indeed all of American business and our society, but they also had the aspect of being negative inventions as well. And there's really two aspects of that. One is that they sped things up, and the second thing is that they made it easier for documents to be longer. So the speeding up, similar to Board Portal, is it used to be that way back when, probably even before I practiced law, that you had to wait a while for documents to be delivered. And you factor that into the process of doing transactional law where I practice, or communications to lawyers or clients. And so now when things can be delivered instantaneously, there is a tendency, first of all, to wait till the last minute. And that means that you may or may not be as efficient as you need to be. The other thing is that you can take longer to do things. I think if you were typing with carbon paper, you were much less likely to insert long paragraphs and forgive errors, whereas if you can be typing documents up to the last minute and fixing everything and then just throwing in whole sections, you're more likely to do that. Indeed, that's what we have done. It doesn't necessarily mean the work product's better, but it does mean you do have that capability. I mean, litigation has not declined because the loan documents are longer, for example. And so it's important to keep in mind that the real point of this slide is that just because there's new technology doesn't mean you can just plug it in and use it without considering its consequences or the implications. And, of course, we're all subject to the GIGO principle, which is garbage in and garbage out. The materials that are prepared don't create themselves. Brian, if you can move to the next slide. So, as we all know, board and committee meetings typically require hundreds or even thousands of pages of material. Certainly, over the course of a year, it is thousands of pages of materials, all of which, or much of which, contain some of the most important information for the company. It's important to keep in mind that not only are we trying to deliver these materials to board members and board reporters and their advisors, but the real point of it, at least under virtually every state law I'm aware of, is to provide for thoughtful decisions by the board so that they can execute on their fiduciary responsibilities. So we talked about security, which is pretty much done more effectively by board portals, but also needs to be timely delivered. And the reason why that's important is because the board members need to be able to spend their time and enough time thinking about these issues so that they can render the most prudent decisions of information that's relevant. And one of the experiences that we all run into is just because there's more material and you can create more material, going back to the example of word processing, doesn't mean it makes it easier for people to decide. It can be a lot harder to decide or focus in on decisions when the material is so voluminous. 10Ks, for example, now typically run at least 200 pages, but question whether people are making more informed decisions on the basis of the 10Ks simply because they're longer. I would suggest, for example, in that circumstance, they're not. And so if you send out hundreds of pages of board materials, the question is whether the board is able to focus on all that material and whether it all needs to be delivered to them. So that leads us to the next slide. And what role will the board portals play in the amount of reading for the board? The easier it is to upload, if you save money on copying and staff time in preparing the board materials, will that mean that there's even more materials dumped on the board? And will this result in the most critical decisions being further obscured? And will this affect the board's decision-making purpose and consequently their role in executing on their fiduciary duties? If we go to the next slide, it touches on the same point or a related point, which is will they have time to digest all the materials? At least when you had to mail the materials out, you sort of thought in your head, as one example, if the board meeting was on a Tuesday, you wanted to get it out Wednesday, the board member would probably receive it on Thursday, maybe he or she would start looking at it on Friday, and he or she would have the whole weekend to look at it. Well, if you can pump that material up on the board portal immediately, and it's a Tuesday board meeting, are you doing it on Monday so that you have the weekend to work on it? I mean, because after all, you can. And maybe you're not putting all the material up, but maybe putting up some of the material up later. And that gives the board members less time potentially to review the materials. Frequently, the most important materials are done last because they're the hardest and they may have the latest breaking information in them. And so the question at the bottom is, will the board members have enough time to do it? Now, we all know that there's certain circumstances that board members have to operate, as we all do, with limited time. You're in the midst of a negotiation for an acquisition. There's a crisis of a particular type, let's say a public relations crisis affecting the board. Well, the niceties of having enough time disappear go by the wayside. But to the extent we're talking about regular decisions, regular meetings, it can be dangerous or at least unhelpful to run into situations where the board is looking at things at the last minute. So if you go to the next slide, one of the things that I have done and I recommend for other people to do is really evaluate what goes into these materials. Now, again, the tendency with this wonderful technology is just say, well, what's the difference? You just press a button, and I'm oversimplifying, Tom, and the material goes bam on the board portal, period, end of sentence, and let the board members sort through the materials and whether they need to read it or not. But it's no less important, is the point I keep making, to evaluate how important it is, and maybe even more so. So we know that some of the reason that there are hundreds of pages in these board packages is because of regulatory requirements. The biggest one, and one that's around the longest, is Sarbanes-Oxley, right? Who thought of or who heard of internal controls in any extensive way before Sarbanes-Oxley? Well, that generates a lot of paper. And I'm not going to say it's not important, particularly when we're identifying material deficiencies. So there's nothing in many cases that can be done about that. But what about the other two items under that heading? What about you're providing a report because you always provided the report? Well, maybe that needs to be looked at. But it's easier just to let it go because it's sort of hard to think about whether that material is covered in a report or where or modifying those reports. And, of course, let's face it, on this call, in this webcast, we can be open that sometimes reports are just sent to the board because it's just harder to figure out whether it's absolutely necessary, and you might as well cover your rear end to make sure the board has it and their rear end that they have it, and that tends to generate a lot of materials. So how do you go about deleting this stuff is very important. One is you need to question each report, and I said on a rotating basis because you can't do it all at once. You'll never get it done. So you take a little piece of it for one meeting and maybe the next meeting and do it over a period of a year or two and figure out whether the reports that are being delivered are necessary, and if so, what parts of it are necessary, and is it presented the best way. You can ask your board either in the form of a formal self-assessment, which most boards are doing now, or even an informal assessment, the chances are your board members are going to be very, very clear about what they like, what they think they find useful, and what they don't find useful. And you need to allow for more time to prepare these materials, at least when you're starting out down this road, because we all know it's more time-consuming to edit it. It's interesting. We're all familiar with the quote, "If I had more time, I would have written a shorter letter." It's usually attributed to Mark Twain. One of my pet peeves, and I have many of them, is that people don't cite quotes even though it's very easy to do it now with the web. That's actually did not start with Mark Twain. I started with a Frenchman by the name of Blaise Pascal, I found out when I looked it up online. But it doesn't really matter who said it. The point is we all know that it's the case that, it's harder to write a 4-page report on a topic than an 8-page report and have it really be important. And then the other things you need are sunset provisions. Look, if this report, let's just see if we need it for 2 years. If we don't, in 2 years, let's look at what the form of it is. And that should be formally adopted, as well as a tickler system to remind ourselves to look at materials on a regular basis. If you go to the next slide,
Steve,
I think one of the critical things that people keep with board materials, the copying, is when you had to prepare all these materials and send out to the board members, you had one person who was the quarterback. Maybe it was the corporate secretary, maybe it was the CEO's administrative assistant, general counsel, CFO, whoever it was. Everything had to go through that person so that the board members were not getting all the materials from different places and at different times and trying to put it together themselves. So I think you still have to impose that discipline even with board portals so that people are not uploading stuff on the board portal simply because they can and it's so easy to do. And I've talked to plenty of general counsels and corporate secretaries and other people using it, and they find that to be absolutely critical. And that's an internal decision that each company has to make. The other aspect that's interesting in board portals is less important information. There's an article about the company, or there's an earnings release or a report or something like that. The question is whether you use the board portals for that. Certainly, as Tom will tell you, it's something easy to do. Well, typically speaking, when you're sending out board materials in these huge bulk, you'll send it with that, because as long as you're sending stuff to the board, you might as well throw that in, unless it's really critical or really urgent. You can upload that stuff on a regular basis using the board portal, again, using the one person to control it. But I've talked to general counsels and corporate secretaries, and people have different mind. Why keep on sending this stuff if you don't have to? It's available if they need to. And I think reasonable minds can differ about that. And I think one of the other things to keep in mind is always expect there's going to be glitches. As wonderful as the technology is for board portals and generally, and for the one that ComputerShare has, there's going to be glitches. And you need to allow for that, because otherwise it'll just add to your stress. I think it's also important, one of the questions we got the first time we did this is it's absolutely critical for your IT folks to be involved in this decision. They have to be comfortable doing it. You need at least 2 people in your organization who can help with it. One person who'll do it regularly, and the other person will do it when the other person's sick or on vacation. And so if we go to the last slide, I think we can sum up that the ideal solution is, as is said in the heading, thoughtful implementation of board portals. Prepare and disseminate the materials as you ordinarily would, if not more rigorously, and then you can take advantage of the best security, the fastest delivery, protection through retention that works for e-discovery, and really the ultimate goal is to improve the board decision-making so they can carry out their fiduciary duties most effectively. I don't know if you have anything else to add on that, Tom.
No, I do. I think, I completely agree with the new tool doesn't solve the problem. It's sort of with great power comes great responsibility. And if I have to cite that, Steve, I think that was Voltaire. But
thank you.
But that was for you. But really, you have the portal is the vehicle, but absolutely, you got to step back now and look at your process and what information you're sharing. The portal allows you to choose different areas, though, to how to disseminate that information. So things like, you have your meeting, your book, and that's the book maybe today that's 500 pages. But the portals have reference material. So if, as you say, if in that book, every single time you put the governance policies or you put the product branding strategy or whatever it is, you put those same materials in the book every single time. Rather than put them in the book, you can put them in a different location. You can put them in a reference material so that the book now maybe becomes 200 pages of critical information for the director to review in advance of the meeting. They can always refer back to, and that's one of the other nice things about the way the portals are set up. They are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, where they can go back if they're thinking about something and refer back to previous materials, previous board meetings, again, all based on the security and the privileges that you decide of how you want to roll them out. But you can change the direction or the paradigm, if you will, of how directors think about their materials, as opposed to it being I get a book once a quarter in the mail. It's I have this portal that I can go to as I'm thinking about things, and I can draw down the material, and I can draw down what's useful for helping me make a decision towards the business, right? And you can do things like their assessments. You can do them right through the portals. So now you can, as they're getting their information in a new way, ask them, "Is this working for you?" And do your your board assessment right there through the portal as well. So absolutely, the change in technology provides you the opportunity to rethink how you're distributing or what you're distributing to the boards.
Tom, I think you made two excellent points, and I want to just put in the practical context of someone who has been on the not literally in the trenches, but in the trenches preparing these materials. You get into a situation where you're writing a memo to the board and it refers to two policies. And you sort of look at the person you're working with saying, well, should we include these policies? And, well, they may not have them, or we got to make sure. Now, some of the board members may be very organized and have them at home, although that's a different issue. And some, let's throw them in. And it happens all the time. And so what is a 4-page memo then becomes a 34-page document that include, because there's two policies each, one of 20 and one of 10. And I think the other point that you made that's really good is, frequently a lot of people won't send out the board assessment questionnaires because they have some issues with it, being out there, that some plaintiff's lawyers are going to say, well, you asked the board members whether they thought they were doing a good job. And what was the answer to that? Whether it's privileged or not, we can spend a lot of time talking about it. Well, if that self-assessment is up there and you destroy it after the self-assessment's over, and that's in accordance with your policies, and that's not a violation of your e-discovery policies, then you don't have to worry about that being out there. At the same time, the directors can actually see that question and not have to worry about what it sounded like to them on the phone, because I have conducted some of those on the phone because the company didn't want to send out the questionnaires to the board members, lest they get into the wrong hands or lest it lay around with their notes on it in their garage in case some plaintiff's lawyer was able to find it and had sued them on some aspect of the corporate decision-making process. So I think those are really good points. I mean, one of the things that's great about technology, which is an upside, and I talked about the downside, is that you find better ways to do stuff as you progress through it. And that's also a good thing. I mean, we don't really do in-person closings very much anymore, and that has its advantages and disadvantages. But that just evolved because what's the point? We can just get signatures by PDF now.
Good point. Brian, do we have turn it to questions at this point?
Sure. Well, first, Tom and Steve, extremely insightful both on the technology and the dissemination of the materials, and many other considerations that I'm sure we're all thinking about right now. For our Q&A session in the chat window, which should be in the bottom right of your screen, feel free to type in questions. We have a number of them already, and we'll address as many as we can during the session itself. If you don't want to, obviously answer a question today, we have contact information here for both Steve and Tom, and certainly if you'd like a copy of today's presentation or a recording of it, please reach out to either Tom or Steve, and can distribute that. So a number of questions, very interesting ones that came up. One is, I think, Tom, this may be kind of better addressed to you. Presumably the data is resident on the portal, not on the tablet. What prevents the data from being copied to the device and being subject to theft hack? So that may be more around a kind of an offline view of what the portal capability has to protect against that.
Sure, and I think that's a good question that really depends on the particular vendor or portal that you're looking at, and I can really only speak to the portal that we have from that perspective, in that there are security settings where you can disable the ability to print, as Steve was saying before. You can disable the ability to forward, or email out that materials, and you have the ability to save where or limit where it's going to be saved to. So, for our example, if it's on the iPad, we have a secure vault that we call it that sits on your iPad that you can limit all the things that we just said, and then it can be remotely wiped, as we say, from that tablet, so that if it has been, if the tablet has been lost or compromised or whatever, the administrator can go in and remove that automatically from you. So you have all the security to destroy the document and limit what the director or what the end user is able to see and do with it.
Thanks, Tom. I think this is a good one for Steve. Steve, does the use of the board portal slow down the review of materials at the board meetings? And maybe, Tom, you can comment on that as well from the technology perspective too.
Not in my experience, but I think it depends on the board members themselves. First of all, just a somewhat humorous aside is all these directors sitting at the board meeting with their iPads open. You never really know what they're looking at, and you just hope they're not checking the stock prices or the ball game or whatever. But that does happen, by the way. It's sort of like being on a personally texting during a board meeting. But assuming that's not going on, it really depends. And part of the thing, too, is it's less important for them to follow along necessarily with the iPads during the board meeting than to read the materials in advance. I mean, ideally speaking, and this is very hard to do, is that the board meeting should be a discussion about the materials. And I don't think it's necessarily any easier to go through and leaf through those huge binders of hundreds of pages and say tab 7 on page 13 of section 4. So I don't think it necessarily slows down the board review and the board meetings themselves, and that has not been my experience.
Yeah, and to maybe add to that, I think it only improves the ability to review the information. Certainly, there are people that are going to be traditional, old-fashioned, that want their paper to thumb through. But as you're going through it, one, you can from a portal. Typically, you can drive the presentation right from the materials that's on the portal. So you're using them. You don't have to go then and create a separate PDF file or PowerPoint set to go through at the meeting. You can bring it up on the screen right through the portal. The directors can follow along with their iPad or with their laptop, whatever it is, and you can easily jump. So if somebody says, go to section 5, page 3, you can just go, type in page 5, or just click on it and drag it to page 5, whatever it is. You can quickly and easily. You can do things, and we've seen people start to change the way that the books or the materials are even presented, because instead of having all these charts and exhibits that are at the back of the book, they can now be little graphs, and they can be little icons that sit, on page 5, right below the financial comments. You can have a graph that you click on, and it opens up the chart right there in front of you. So you don't have to dig 5, or 30, 50 pages back further into the book to get the actual chart that relates to the materials. You can have it right there on the screen, and when you click on it, it can pop right up in front of you. So you can leverage technology to change, again, the way that you produce those books.
And there's also one other thing, Tom, correct me if I'm wrong, but, you can make things look bigger on the iPad, and frequently you're looking at rows of numbers. they can be in pretty small type. And if you can just sort of expand it with your fingers, as you can do it with the Apple technology, you just make it easier for people to see numbers. And the copying also, sometimes it would get a little bit blurry by the time you're running the 10th copy through. So it's all clear as if it's been uploaded the first time. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So it's coming directly from the Excel spreadsheet or the PowerPoint slide.
So it's easier to read, is my point.
Right.
Yeah.
It's easier to read, and then you're right. You can do sort of the pinch and spread, or whatever the right terminology for that is on the iPad, where you can actually zoom in just with your finger, right? So you can do all of that kind of technology. Which you're right. It's much easier than getting your magnifying glass out to be able to look at the
which sometimes you need to do.
Right. And if I can comment too, I would think the idea here is the immediacy of the delivery through the portal is really going to reduce the amount of review during the board meeting itself, because if the general counsel, corporate secretary can push out these materials well in advance through the portal, if they have offline viewing of the materials itself, it gives them ample time to be prepared during the meeting itself. And of course, Tom talked a little bit about the navigation and quickly being able to jump to a certain page or notes and so forth, which is a great feature. That kind of leads into the next question, which is, can directors add their own notes to the materials?
Certainly, I'll take that one. One of the most important end user functionalities in a board portal is the ability to annotate. So you need to be able to take your notes, and just like you would with a piece of paper, write your Post-it notes, but you can take it a step further, and you can easily, you can color code them, you can highlight things, you can circle things, you can, write with your finger if you choose, or you can type into message boxes. There's all sorts of different tools out there that you can use, and ours has a particular one kind of embedded into it, but there's different ways you can do it. And you can have, you can, again, take your notes to the next level. You can collate your own notes. So we'll have directors that'll handwrite, or they'll type in all of their notes, they'll color code them, and then you can have like a little file sheet that will come up and show you, here are all the comments that you've made, and you can categorize them and sort them and search on them and things like that. Again, taking a step further from just handwriting notes on a Post-it note that you got to kind of flip through and remember where you put which note type of thing. And again, the nice thing about the notes, typically within the portals, they'll be resident on that particular iPad. So if and when the materials have been deleted or they have been purged by the administrator, the notes go with them. The notes, can be set to be, private to that director, so they're not getting shared with other people. And then they can be destroyed after the meeting, just as they would when you did the old push the books to the middle of the room, they get shredded type of thing. So the notes go with it.
Great. Excellent. Thanks, Tom. That might tie into another question, around the security as well, or rather the functionality of the portal itself. Can directors print materials from the portal, and if so, how do you control those materials?
Again, speaking to our portal and our tool, the BoardWorks application, the way it works, is that it is a system setting. You can choose whether you want to let your directors print the materials or not. Typically, companies are setting it as a default to say no, you can't print it, because that's kind of the concept, that it stays within the portal. So you can set that as a system setting. If you do want to choose to allow them to print, you still want to, and typically people will do that as they're in the adoption phase of the site, right? So, like Steve says, you can't change all of the, you can't go from 500 pages to 100 pages overnight. A lot of times companies don't go sort of the cold turkey and go from all the paper to just the iPad in one meeting. They'll kind of phase it in a little bit so that the directors get comfortable with the technology. So, allowing them to print for the first couple meetings and then kind of pulling it back into no print is realistically probably the way that people will roll it out. But the most secure way to do it is to don't let them print at all and keep everything in the portal.
Okay. A couple good questions for Steve here. Being both in-house and experience as general counsel and a corporate secretary, I think it's really a two-part question here, Steve. One, in your experience, what is the best way to approach the board with a change to the process? And I think a second part to that would be what percentage of the clients you work with today would say use a board portal versus continue with a manual process?
The second question is easier. I would say about half of the clients I work with are using board portals, but it's accelerating. And so I expect that number to continue to go up. And I would add one other thing. I don't know anybody, either I represent or anybody else has represented, that once they've adopted a board portal, they've gone back. So I think there's only one way that trend is going to go. As far as change, it's hard to answer in the abstract because every board is different. But I think the general approach you take is you go slower rather than fast. I actually talked to, this wasn't my experience, but I talked to a general counsel and corporate secretary who was getting all jazzed up about the new technology, and he, the board was gung-ho, and he says, so it's a done deal, we'll do it then. And his chairman said, well, let's take a step back and think about it. So you have to manage the personalities, including the CEO and the CFO and everybody at the company as well. But I think generally raising the issues, showing the advantages, maybe doing a trial of the board portal technologies so they can see the benefits. A lot of companies are giving board members iPads if they don't have them already. That's a sweetener as well. And I think and also providing the IT support and answering the questions also will help them move more comfortably to the board portal. But go slower than you think, because it's much better for people saying what took you so long than people to turn around and say, what just happened?
Okay, thanks, Steve.
As my colleagues found out, I guess he had a talking to in the room after in the CEO's office or the chairman's office after the meeting.
Sure. I'd say to that, our implementation team that does a lot of the rollouts, they always talk to companies about what the crawl, walk, run kind of mentality, right? And
I'll repeat it, Tom. Get your IT folks involved, because it's great to have this wonderful technology and have everybody rep to do it. It's like so many other things, like all this other technology I mentioned. If you can't implement it, it does you no good. So, one of the people, this is true of anybody in a business organization, really any organization. You have to get the IT folks on board. Otherwise, most of what we want to do can't get done.
Great. And another question. Steve, any high-level advice on the reduction of the volume of pages and materials that are sent to the board?
Yeah,
I think broad question.
No, I think you can pick out the reports almost without thinking of it by just going back to the ones that have been generated the longest. And I'm not talking about, the financial numbers. The ones that have been in there and you turn around and you suspect it along, well, no one has a really good idea why it's in there. 9 times out of 10 you can get rid of that, or at least include it in another report. It's just amazing. I've run this to almost every organization I've been. When you ask someone to explain why something is done, you get it so frequently, well, it's always been done that way. And that applies to reports. And the oldest reports are the ones like no one ever has questioned in a long time. I mean, it's almost like the emperor's new clothes. Like everybody says, well, I thought you wanted it. And no, I thought you needed it in. And you just sort of look at each other and laugh and then take it out. And the other thing you can do is take I had one CFO in an organization who was something of a he had a wicked sense of humor, and he would take stuff out and wait for the board members to ask where the report is. And if they didn't ask where it was out permanently.
All right, we have another one here, Steve, and I suppose, Tom, you could talk to the technology behind it too. How commonplace is the destruction of board books /notes?
Not as commonly as it should be. I think the telling point, I think I said this on the last webcast too, I think the telling point in Tom's story about the general counsel who almost fell out of her chair is the fact that she almost fell out of her chair. And not because she was naive, but because let's face it, e-discovery is a nightmare for any in-house lawyer, and really any executive if they took the time to think about it. And if you really think through the implications of that, the biggest danger are people who are not affiliated with the company, and that includes board members who are stocking this stuff away. And so I think you have to be, very rigorous in how you apply these retention policies, and it's just hard to remember this in the heat of getting a litigation getting a case filed against you and having to do a litigation hold. And so I think it's absolutely way too common for people to hang on to it. It's a natural phenomenon for people to do. There are pack rats in every organization. It's not just board members. It's not just lawyers or accountants. There are pack rats. There are people who want to hold on to some things just because they're not comfortable throwing it out. And I've had conflicts with those people in the past because there's frequently not only no good reason not to have that stuff, but there's frequently many negative reasons to get rid of that, to keep that stuff. And so there's good reasons to get rid of it. I think there's also a misleading thing is some boards or some board meetings end, particularly ones with you're talking about an acquisition or something, and everybody ceremoniously moves their materials to the center of the table, and somebody's supposed to go and destroy them. And what people tend to lapse into is to think that's all the materials they are. What they forgot is that some of the materials were also sent to these people electronically or physically, and those pose the same risk as the ones that have just been ceremoniously dumped in the middle of the table. So you can also fool yourself, is my point about that.
Great. Thank you again, Steve. I just want to remind everyone before, if we go too far on the tablet itself, that CGS conducts weekly webinars on Thursday of the BoardWorks application. If you visit CGS for Computershare Governance Services, so that's cgs.computershare.com. These are free weekly webinars, and we walk through all aspects of the portal on the iPad, PC, and other devices as well, but primarily on the iPad. I know we have just about 5 minutes left, so I think this may be a question for both of you, really. Suggestion on selling the portal approach. We generally include it as an integral and essential part of the governance regime, and I think maybe that talks beyond the actual technology itself and the convenience of it, but how does it, as a part of the governance regime, how do you really pitch that to your general counsel and to the board?
Well, I'll just take the first part of that. I mean, I think sell is actually a good word in this context, and it's so hard to sell anything really that's new and technology that's new without putting in the context of why it's necessary. And so it's almost along the lines of what really pretty much what Tom was saying. It's like we want security over our documents, right? We want to comply with our policies, including retention of documents policies, right? And if you head down that road, it's a more logical consequence of the corporate initiatives rather than a separate initiative. It's not much different than saying you want to cut costs because most organizations want to cut costs. In fact, I can't think of one that doesn't. And so if those are your parameters, those are your values, those are your objectives, the board portal for it fits neatly within that rather than saying I got this new thing I want to adopt. And I realize that's an idealized version of the sales process, but I think that's the best way to approach it.
I would agree. I think the security and the compliance component of it is 9 times out of 10 what the board is going to be more interested in. We've certainly seen companies go the other way and really kind of go the cool factor of it, and they roll out iPads, they give the directors iPads, as part of the distribution, and so their incentive to use it is they just got a free iPad from the company. So there's certainly that component, and some companies have certainly gone that direction with it. Compliance is fun and exciting, but a free iPad is pretty cool. But really the selling feature really is the compliance and the security around of the materials, and it really elevates or brings to the front the security around what this group of people does on a monthly, quarterly basis.
Okay. Well, thanks, Steve. Thanks, Tom. I appreciate that. Again, just want to remind everyone at cgs.computershare.com you can register for weekly BoardWorks webinars. And again, obviously, Steve and Tom's contact information is here if you have additional questions that may come up, certainly after we conclude today. So please feel free to reach out to Steve or Tom for additional information, or if you'd like a copy of today's presentation, we'd be happy to provide that as well. So with that, certainly want to thank you, Steve and Tom, for your time today. Again, extremely insightful things on not just the technology, but the delivery itself. And again, thank you everyone for joining us, and hope to have you with us in a future session.